All my quarantine savages out there. What a new world we live in now. I got the savage beard. It didn't take long. I forgot how to shave. So that's part of the quarantine. So much is new. This is so different. It's fun to see you all and to be at the gallery, but I miss having you here, roaming free. I miss that. So many new things in the lexicon nowadays. The new phrases and words that we use that are kind of echo over and over. The stay home, stay home, stay home. What's the shelter in place? Hear that a lot. Shelter in place, shelter in place. And what's the other? Oh, flatten the curve, flatten the curve, flatten the curve. All these echo now. It's so different. So things are different, but it's good to be here with you. So I decided, since I've missed the last few weeks, the last few months, that I got 3 thoughts, since this will be the 3rd one. And here's what they are. These are what I want to kind of present to you this evening. The first is President versus the press. The second, the push. And the third is the hunt for Bigfoot. Now, we'll start with the first, but I'll give a trigger warning for the first one. The third one, I'll give you guys a spoiler alert. I have found Bigfoot. But you'll have to wait for that. But first, we're going to start with the president versus the press. And I think the office of president is important. I think the press is very important. So, what I have here are words. I was told I could write things down. And I didn't want to memorize it because these are the words of the president. And I wasn't sure if I wanted them in my head because they're dangerous words. And they're just a little bit of paranoia in them. It's directed at the press. I'll leave it for you to decide. But I'm going to read. I'm not going to do the voice or the accent. I don't do impressions, so that won't be a part of it. You can put that voice in your head if you'd like. But I have the words. So here we go. This is an address by the President of the United States before the American Newspaper Publishers Association. Now, this, and I quote, now the President's words. I have selected as the title of my remarks tonight, the President and the Press. Some may suggest that this would be more naturally worded, the President versus the press. But those are not my sentiments tonight. For we are, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to condense this so you won't get all the words. You can go find the entire speech. But I'm going to compress to the highlights. So here we go. The President of the United States. 4. We are oppressed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. Nevertheless, every democracy recognizes the necessary restraints of national security. And the question remains whether those restraints need to be more strictly observed if we are to oppose this kind of attack, as well as an outright invasion. For the fact of the matter are that this nation's foes have openly boasted, they've boasted of acquiring through our newspapers information they would otherwise hire agents to acquire through theft, bribery, or espionage. I've selected as the title of my, wrong card. Back to the President. But I would be failing in my duty to the nation in considering all of the responsibilities that we now bear and all of the means at hand to meet these responsibilities if I did not commend this problem to your attention in urgent, thoughtful consideration. This was back on April 27th, so a little while ago, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. April 27, 1961, that is President John F. Kennedy. Now, if you go, and since we're all quarantined, I think history is important. I'm definitely not going to talk about current events. I think it's safer to go back 60 years because none of us were around then, so this is not our problem. But we can learn a lot from history. So I think it's a good idea while quarantined, maybe to look at some of the things that happened in the past and see if we can learn from them. So that was President John F. Kennedy, April 27, 1961. He goes on to talk about secret oaths, secret societies, a lot of stuff that, seemed a little paranoid, but I kind of dove a little more into President Kennedy. So a few things for you guys, if you have time. I think you do. So Executive Order 1110, check that out, pretty cool. I'm a big fan of declassified documents because that way you can kind of shut out all the noise and just get right to the truth. So that's an interesting place to start. That's when President Kennedy put the power of the Treasury to print money instead of the Federal Reserve. So by doing that, we didn't have to pay interest to the Federal Reserve because it's a private bank and it's not federal. So interesting. Also, another one that's interesting is Operation Norwoods. Now that one is fascinating because Operation Norwoods, again declassified, what happens there is the president gets on his desk from the Joint Chief of Staff a document and a proposal to him to sign, and it was for a false flag by the CIA and the Department of Justice on American citizens. There was talks of blowing up a plane, civilian casualties, to point to Cuba as a pretext for war with Cuba. And God bless John F. Kennedy, he said no. So interesting, the office of the president, big decisions. But unfortunately for him, he ended up publicly executed and didn't get to finish his term, but who did was Lyndon B. Johnson, and he was presented with something interesting. The Gulf of Tonkin, another great historical incident that to go look at, declassified documents. And in that, this false flag was pretext for war with Vietnam. And so, interesting enough, President Kennedy said no. A new proposal came. This false flag gets us into Vietnam. 58,220 was one of the numbers I saw for American soldiers who died. So, very interesting facts to go into and look to educate ourselves while we're quarantined. So what else do we got to do? But with that, we'll move out of the educational historical stuff and get to something a little more today. That's 2016. That is The Push. So if you haven't seen The Push, highly recommend it. The Push was a show that was done by Darren Brown. Darren Brown's a mentalist or illusionist in Britain. And so what he did in 2016 is he posed the question. So if you go even just watch the promo, it's fascinating. In the promo, he says, pretty simple, the question we are proposing is, through social pressure, can we make a normal human being push another living human being to their death and commit murder? Fascinating. So what he does is he takes, he gets 70 actors together. I'm going to spoil some of it, but not all of it. But it was out of 2016, so get with it. So it's important for you to know. So here's the deal. So what he does is he gets 70 actors, choreographs this whole thing. They get a subject that thinks he's there for business. And so the whole premise is The Push. So The Push is a fake nonprofit to raise money for kids. So his company, he's under the illusion that he's going to be working this event with the president of the Push. So he comes in, 70 actors, cameras everywhere. He has no idea he's being filmed. They do it on the top of this big building. They use a big conference area, and then they use the roof. And so I won't give away all of it, but this is, I'll give away most of it. So here's what they do. So they take this man, and the premise is, can we get him to commit murder within a couple hours? So he comes in, and the first thing they do is they kind of set him up into some conditioning by making him make a choice of doing something he normally wouldn't do. So they put him in a room with the chef. The chef's kind of crazy, moving around trying to get the food out to the guests, and he asked him to help. And he asked him to put little flags into the meatballs. And there's ones that are regular meatballs and ones that are vegetarian. And he knows this, but he says, just put the flag in that one. Don't worry about it. So he's now asking him to put vegetarian flags into a meatball that's not vegetarian. Small thing, but he knows better. But they pressure him to do it, and he does. So once he does it, they go upstairs to Big Brother, Darren Brown with his headset and all his TVs, and he's like, yes, like we've got him, the first one. Because he knows if he can condition him to do things that he normally wouldn't do, then he can move him along. So they interweave him into this web of lies, one little one after another, and they compound and compound. And out of the goodness of his heart, he just wants to help these kids. So they just lure him in deeper and deeper and deeper. So eventually there comes the point where he's so deep into this that he has to make a decision. He thinks the things he has done are going to put him in jail. And so he's now surrounded by people that he just met that night, and they're collectively trying to get him to do something. Now, earlier in the night, there was a big auction, and during the auction they had all of these TVs with celebrities that he would know in Britain, and the celebrities would come on the screen to give legitimacy to to this fake push. And so they would say, hey man, we're big fans of the push, help the kids, do whatever it takes. And then the next celebrity, do whatever it takes, the push, we love it. The next celebrity. And so in the background there's all of this they're implanting the push, do whatever it takes, do whatever it takes, do whatever it takes, like a mantra. So at the end, after all of this unravels, he's in a moment with a man sitting at the edge of the building, and they're all saying, go, do it for the kids, the push, let's do it, and we're with you, do whatever it takes. And so this moment, you get to watch this man have to make a choice. Now, I'm wrecking it for you. He doesn't do it. But you see the internal, like how close he comes. And it's frightening to think that you could be pushed that far. And then it becomes more frightening when they show 3 other people they did the same thing with. And all 3 of them pushed the man off the edge. Now he's held to a cord, so they don't know that. And he's caught. But 3 normal, 2 women, just gentle little girls, and they go over and they're like, they push him off within a couple hours of being socially engineered and pressured. So fascinating show, The Push. I highly recommend that. So that brings us now to the big discovery, Bigfoot. So the hunt for Bigfoot has been something for me my whole life. I've always been fascinated with Bigfoot. So in order to find Bigfoot, I had to go back to the 1800s and start my search. And the search started in the Great Plains in the middle of America. And for a little context of what's happening in the 1800s in America is you have all the settlers that have come, and they're moving in manifest destiny, and they're coming to settle the United States and to take all of this land, and they're going to California, the gold rush. And what happens in the middle of that is as the settlers move, they start clashing with the natives, the indigenous people. Now at that time in the Great Plains, there was estimated up to 60 million buffalo in the Great Plains. They said there would be herds that would be 30 miles long, from Billings all the way to Park City and beyond. And so there was massive herds, and the natives, they were nomadic people, and they would move with the herds. And it was really a beautiful thing, if you have the time to look into, is the relation between the buffalo and the Indian people. Because it was almost their entire economy, because outside of water, everything really rested with the buffalo. They would, take their curved bows, and they would go out in a hunt, and because they were bows, they would have to hit 7, 8, 10, 12 shots before they could take down a buffalo. And so it was, a dangerous event, and that's where they kind of got their stripes as warriors, when they weren't in fighting and they were doing this. And so they would use everything. They used the meat, of course. They harvested the meat. They used parts of it for medicine. They used the fur for blankets, and the skin they used for their teepees. And they used literally everything. The bows, the string on the bow was taken from the buffalo, and so it was. There was a religious kind of connection, a spirit connection with the buffalo and the natives, and they had much respect for the buffalo. So what happened was, in order to tame the Indians, the Indian Wars started in the 1800s, and as those kind of waged on, what happened was the American government would come, and they would have these clashes, and then there would be a treaty. And then when the treaty would happen, then the American government would break it. And then they would give them promises for a certain land, and they would break it. And they would do another treaty, and they would break it. And another, and they would break it, and just continuous breaking of these oaths and these pledges to the native people. And so they were pushing the indigenous people to, they wanted them on reservations because they were roaming freely. And so one of the things they did was they decided to, if they killed the buffalo, so if you're here in Billings, that the Primary Library, I remember years ago going in there, and it may still be there, there was a plaque on the wall from like the Secretary of State or someone, but it stated the Indian problem, and said, we have the Indian problem, the solution was this. It said the Indians are nomadic people. And so to control the Indian, you need to control their food supply. So you control the buffalo. You kill the buffalo, you control the Indian. And so that became what they did. And so over a 60-year period, the buffalo went from 60 million all the way down to thousands. 60 million, like 1 million buffalo slaughtered a year. And since the white men had guns, they would come and they could shoot from a distance, and it would take the buffalo down, and they wouldn't scatter. So they could just shoot one at a time, and they would like cut out the tongue and just let it rot. And then they would come back later for, once the meat and everything had rotten, they would come back for the furs. And so when the native people saw this, they didn't understand. They thought the white man was crazy, because why would they do this? And so that was what was happening at this time. And so in the by 1890, the Indian Wars had completed. If you've been to the Battle of Little Bighorn, the natives call that the greasy grass, but the white man calls it the Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of Little Bighorn. And after that battle, when the natives defeated the 7th Cavalry, there was much retribution afterwards, and it had now been 15 years since then. And so the Indians had been suppressed, their food supply had been wiped out, and because of that, they were now totally dependent on the government. They had their small little areas, only a couple. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were still, resisting becoming part of the reservation, but they were both eventually murdered and killed and executed. So those problems were gone. And as they were controlling the native people, there was a much sadness for them, because their whole way of life had been wiped out. And at that time, there rose a prophet, and he had seen what he thought was a sign in a total eclipse. And he said he had a vision from a divine vision, and the vision told him that if the natives would just dance, they could dance, and they would connect them in the spirit world with those that had passed and their ancestors. And their ancestors could come back, and they could go up into the hills, and then a great flood would come through the plains, and it would wipe out all of the white men, and it would bring back the buffalo, and they could go back to their normal way of life. And so because of this, it started to take root. It was called the ghost dance. And so it started to move within the tribes, and they were desperate. Red Cloud said this. He said they grabbed on to any hope they could because they wanted things to return back to what they knew. See, the men, they could not hunt anymore because the buffalo had been wiped out. The Indian wars were done. They had no purpose anymore. They couldn't hunt or harvest. And then the American government just gave them meat and flour and rations. And so it had broken their spirit as well. And then the rations started to dwindle until they were starving at times. They would eat their horses because of it. It was a very sad mark in our history. And at that time, after Sitting Bull was killed, his people they were in fear, and they ran to chief of the Lakota Sioux, and they went there for protection to Chief Bigfoot. And Chief Bigfoot was a warrior, but he had now seen what was happening, and he now just wanted to protect the children, protect the women, and he knew that the cavalry was coming. And so he decided to move to South Dakota and to unite with Red Cloud and to find peace for the people and to save the women and children. But at this time when they started to move, there was a couple reservations that the ghost dance had become prevalent. And because of the relations between the cavalry and the white men and the natives, there was misunderstandings in culture. And often they would send somebody over a reservation that had no understanding of human behavior, had no understanding of culture or the native people, and they would be set. One of those men, I think his name was Daniel Royer, I believe was his name, and he was set over the Pine Ridge reservation to control it. And he was called by the natives. They would use they would name people if they found them peculiar, and they called him the boy who was afraid of the red man, I think is what the boy who's afraid of the Indian. And they knew he was afraid of them. And he would watch them dance, and it terrified him, and he would try to get them to stop the ghost dance. He was like the pastor in Footloose that wouldn't let Red McCormick dance. Like, he was that guy. And he figured if he could keep them from dancing, he could control them. And so he was spooked, and he would send letters back to Washington and to the president. And they were he would be desperate and say, "We're being overrun by the ghost dancers. We're at the mercy in the agency that they control. The agency is at the mercy of the ghost dancers. Send us help. We can't last much longer. You need to send troops, or there will be an outbreak." And then he would send more letters and more, and he kept sending letters. They're dancing again. The ghost dancers are dancing again. In the snow, they're wild and in a frenzy. We can't make them stop. You need to send. There's going to be an uprising, an outbreak. Send. And he even said, "You must send at least 1,000 troops. Without 1,000 troops, there's no way we can stop them from dancing." So he didn't understand the spiritual component. It was the only hope they had, was to try to connect with their ancestors. And because of that, finally the president, the pressure was coming and mounting for him. The political pressure was mounting. And the humanitarian pressure had mounted as well. Because what if? What if people die? What if this outbreak happens and they die? And so the pressure was coming, and he had to make a choice. And he thought, well, whatever it takes, we'll just send, troops. Whatever it takes to keep this outbreak. So they send troops, and as the troops go, the press sees it. Now, the press hasn't had an Indian war in 15 years. When the press see the cavalry moving, they sense something might be happening. So they race to get there. So they go and they converge on Pine Ridge. And they go there looking for the new story, to break the story of the new Indian War. And when they get there, what they find are broken people. And there are broken people that malnutrition, and all their life has been taken from them, everything they know, and they're on rations, but they dance. The one thing they have is the dance. And so they come together every morning and they meet, and they start concocting stories. And they start sending back the headlines, and you should find them and read them. It's heartbreaking, but they send back these, they send the headlines back, and you can read them. They say, savage uprising, squaws, the squaw one was a really good one. The squaws swarm Pine Ridge. They said the headlines said that the army was terrified, and they slept on their arms because they were ready for war. And then every day there would be new, it's critical, impending doom, uprising coming, savages. The savages are sneaky, and they're waiting, just like Custer, and they've just one after another. And the people ate it up because it was, they sold the newspapers. They didn't know, though, that they were reading fiction. They thought it was the truth, but it was fiction. And so the army comes, and they see that Bigfoot is moving his people, 350 people, 120 men, the rest women and children. 120 men, and he's moving to meet up with Red Cloud, to find peace and a place for his people to settle. And the army sends the 7th Cavalry to intercept them, and they do. Now the 7th Cavalry remembers 15 years before when they were defeated by the natives, so there was a lot of hostility still. And of course they're savages, so they're less than human anyways. So they come and they catch up with Bigfoot, and Bigfoot sees that they're there, and he puts up the red or the white flag to show them, he's peaceful. And they come to disarm him because they're told to disarm him and to dismount them. So they come and they line up all the men, and the men are lined up in front of the teepees. They come and they ask for their weapons. They find 30 old rifles, between 120 men, 30 old rifles. But then, I think it's Forsyth was his name, sends them into the teepees to take their curved arrows and their bows, because you must flatten the curved bow and destroy them. So they take all their weapons, and they're totally helpless, waving the white flag. Bigfoot, he's sick because he has pneumonia, and one of the things that happened with the natives is many disease and sickness came to them they never had before. The white men brought that, and the whiskey. And so there they are. He's so sick he couldn't wage battle if he wanted, and it was not his purpose. He wanted to save the kids. He wanted to save the women. So the white flag is up, and he concedes. Everybody knows they're surrounded now because more troops come in while they're sleeping on December 28th. They wake up December 29th, year 1890. They wake up surrounded by even more troops, 500 men armed, and they bring up 4, they were like, they were called the Hotchkiss guns. Hotchkiss. They had the big wheels, and they were much like the Gatling gun. They could do 68 rounds in a minute. 68 rounds in a minute, and up to 2,000 feet they were accurate. And they put them on the hills as they surrounded them. The Hotchkiss guns, the young native boys would soon taste the kiss of those guns. The men were lined up, and a shot rang out. Once that shot rang out, it was like lightning from the sky. Those who survived said it was like lightning and thunder. It was mayhem and blood and screaming and yelling. And they were shooting and mowing down women, kids, and the kids ran. They knew they had to disperse and run. And there was a bloodthirst as he mowed them down. And as they ran, they chased them. Women and children, for 2 miles, they chased them and gunned them down. Like animals, they're savages. They killed almost everybody. And when they did, there was a calm for a moment, and they started to call out, "If you surrender now, you will be okay. The battle is over." And the little Indian boys came out of their hiding. And they shot them down and hacked them with their swords. They liked to run upside them and slice them. It was just brutal. It was a frenzy. They killed Bigfoot. They did have some mercy and took 40, 50 of the women and children, and they put them in this, it was like a chapel, and it was a makeshift hospital. And there was with the cavalry, they had a surgeon and a medic who was a part of all the battles of the Civil War and had seen carnage. And when he came in, he was overwhelmed. Not because of the carnage, he had seen it before. He was overwhelmed because he had never seen that with women and children. And as they laid there, you can see the pictures. There's pictures of them laying there, wounded, bloody, and dying. And since it's December 29th, they just celebrated Christmas. You can see the peace, goodwill to men right behind them. But see, the goodwill was not for them because they were savages. They deserved to die. They were not human. It's a horrible, horrible mark on our country. A blizzard came for 3 days, and they left them out there. When the blizzard was done, the media came to take their pictures. And you can see to this day the pictures of Bigfoot all contorted like this, frozen. Just contorted, and they took the pictures and they made postcards out of them. They sold them. It's postcards so you could send to your family. The Great Indian Wars. In the papers, they wrote about this great battle. The great battle of Wounded Knee. And it was a massacre. They gave 20 medals to these men for bravery. There was 25 soldiers that died because of crossfire from their own men. The frenzy was so crazy. But the paper said this: even though they were disarmed, 120 men with the white flag, surrounded by 500 with the guns, they said this: one Indian had a gun. He didn't give it up. Some accounts say he was from the military, and the paper said he was deaf and that he was dumb. He's a crazy gunman, and that he shot in the air, and that is what started the whole battle. The lone crazed gunman. We would see that again. This is 1890. We would hear that story again 73 years later in Daley Plaza. Very convenient. The lone crazy gunman. There is no record of that amongst the survivors of the native people. The shots came from the only ones that had weapons. They paid people to come $2 a body to drag their bodies over to a ditch, a big hole in the ground. They piled the bodies up first as this big, massive, open grave. They piled up the bodies, frozen bodies, and took pictures. This is 1890. This is 50 years before the Nazis did the same to people that were not human. And they pushed them all into this mass grave in South Dakota. You can go see it today. Bigfoot is real. And I know where he is. He's in a mass grave in South Dakota with women and children. It's very sad. When the natives talk about it, I talked to an Indian friend who says, I was there at Wounded Knee. Impossible he's 60, but he said, the way we live, I heard the stories from elders as a young boy. And the elders heard accounts from their elders of people that were there. And in their culture, they say that means we were there. Our lineage and our blood was spilt there. And the way that we remember these is to tell the stories. So we tell the story of Bigfoot so these things don't happen again. They don't occur now. We can look into history and say, no, we've learned, we've evolved. We don't do this. It's the power of story, is to keep their spirit and the story alive. So Bigfoot is real. He's buried in South Dakota. Now, one last thing I ask as I say goodnight to you. To all my quarantine savages out there, please stay home. Please stay sheltered in place. Don't worry about the hunt. Don't worry about the buffalo. Don't worry. The government will bring you food. Do not dance these spiritual things. We don't want to see this. It's dangerous. No ghost dance. No ghost dance. It can bring an outbreak, an Indian outbreak. No ghost dance. But please do this. Please. For the children, do whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes.